Hello, and welcome to our webinar today. I'm Allie Steeple, the director of the Regeneron Science Talent Search, and I'm joined by my colleague Elaine Edwards, who can give you a wave as well. Together, we run the nation's oldest and most prestigious science research competition for high school students. We together plan every aspect from drafting the rules with the team of advisors. We recruit all of the scientists who help to score the applications and pick those top 40 finalists who join us every spring to compete in finals week. There's a lot to know about how the competition works and how a student can start applying, but we're going to refer you, if you're curious to learn that information, to some of our past webinar sessions. Today's session is going to be the first in a series of 3 where we dive into the rules in a pretty deep manner. We're going to talk about some of the ins and outs, things that you may not know, and things you want to know if you're planning a project for a future year of the Science Talent Search. But just to give you a little bit of background today, if this is your first time learning about who we are and what we do, the Science Talent Search is, like we said, the nation's oldest and most prestigious science research competition for high school students. We run an online application process. The application opens in June every year, and this year it will close on November 6th. So if you are an entrant this year, please mark your calendar. We have a pretty hard deadline. The program is unique because we don't just look at the research you're submitting, we're looking at the full aspect of your high school career. We're looking at your activities, some essays, transcripts, and of course, the science research project that you're going to write into a 20-page paper. The application is free online. If you are not applying this year, but applying in a future year, or you're an adult who is supporting a student in the process, we encourage you to open an application, get to know the material, especially task 3, which is our rules-related task, and we're going to reference here and there in our session today. Of course, students can also win, as mentioned on this slide, up to $250,000, which is the first place prize for our top winner. But again, more on how all of that works in some of our other sessions and on our website. Before we start today, we wanted to talk about what are we doing here on this session? Why are we talking about the rules? What's the high level? Eligibility and processes are discussed in other sessions, like we've mentioned here today. And this first session, we're going to talk about the human rules. In future sessions, we will talk about vertebrate animal rules and PHBAs and hazardous materials. Why do we care about talking to you about the rules? We have the rules book. It's because we want to make sure that students who are working so hard on a science research project and want to share it with us at the Science Talent Search or any other competition out there, we want to make sure that you're actually able to compete and that we don't have to fail to qualify your entry or get disqualified because you don't meet the rules of entry. We want to make sure that you avoid these pitfalls and that your mentors and you are keeping yourself, the researcher, and any subjects, human, animal, and the environment safe in the research process. It's also important to note that while we have our own set of rules, there are some state and federal laws that keep some research consistent. Every lab and research competition might also have their own individual sets of rules that you need to follow for that program. And that applies to us too. Our Regeneron STS rules need to be followed, even in cases where they might be stricter than what your lab or mentor is requiring of you. And that's just the case if you want to enter STS. We recommend for this reason that all entrants, mentors, and supportive adults screen through that rules book annually because we do change things here and there. You can find our rules book if you Google Regeneron STS rules book. It's linked many places on our website as well.
So today what we're going to focus on are the rules for our human participant and human tissue research. We're going to talk about what paperwork and pre-approvals you might need and go through some examples. This we really hope is going to help you place the context of your own project into our rules and understand what you better need to do. But all of that said, we understand that some of the examples we're going to talk about today might not be a perfect fit for your exact project. So for these rules mini sessions, you'll notice these are not like our live webinars. Instead, we're going to encourage you to leave your questions and scenarios for us in the chat. Our team's going to come back to that chat next week to answer them, make sure you get the information you need, and to have that transparent explanation available for others who might be in a similar situation to you. So again, if you do have those questions today, do leave them in the chat and just make sure to check back on this video next week. We also do always encourage entrants to email our team. You can reach us at sts@societyforscience.org anytime. Many members of our staff here at the Society for Science man that inbox to get you the quickest answer, and that's the best way to reach us for sure. Like Ellie said, in the upcoming weeks, we're also going to dive deep into our other rules section. So that's for vertebrate animals and our PHBA and hazardous materials rules. So we will offer a similar opportunity for you to have your questions answered in, again, that really transparent, accessible way right here on our YouTube page. But let's go ahead and get started talking about humans today.
That's right. So you want to work with humans. What does that mean? First, we're going to talk about any approval processes that you might need to go through in order to work with humans. And then, do I really need to do all of this? What counts as research human research that would require a pre-approval? Many students enter or do research and they think or they claim that their work doesn't count as human research, so that didn't need to be pre-approved, when I'm sorry to say it did in many of those cases. So again, we're here today to make sure you avoid those pitfalls and we're all on the same page about what counts as human research. So some things to ask yourself, and in fact, our task 3 within our applications is going to ask you some of these questions too. Ask yourself, are humans involved in any way in my research? And this includes many things: testing an invention, software, following instructions that you drafted, even if it's like blink twice. If you're making a human do it, it counts. If they are providing feedback for you, even if they're just reading something and giving you some feedback that then you use to adjust your device and test it on another human, then that's going to require some pre-approvals. Answering a survey, the rules are different based on, did you design that survey or did someone else design it? But in any case, there's some level of screening we're going to do. If you worked with human cells or tissues like blood, saliva, there are some rules involved there. If you used images of humans to like train an algorithm, there are rules we're going to talk about with that. Lots of examples here. If you ever have a question, again, you can email our team. But again, the basic question is, are humans involved in any way? And if the answer to any of these is yes, then you conducted some level of human research and will either require proof of pre-approval that an appropriate body, which we'll talk about next, pre-approved that project and cleared everything was above board, and or you'll need to share proof of the source of the data. And sometimes this doesn't need to be pre-approved and sometimes it does. So we understand this starts to get a little bit complicated. Again, it's true that some human research does not need to be pre-approved, and we'll get to that. But first, we're going to talk about what we mean by pre-approved and what needs to be pre-approved.
So to understand what projects are going to need pre-approval, a great way to think of this is that's any project where you are dictating another human's time, instruction, a behavior. That's going to need to be approved by something called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. Entrants don't always realize that their project really falls under that umbrella. So again, that's going to be under any of the specific circumstances that we mentioned before. So things like testing an invention, completing a survey that you made, giving blood for your project. If you took a photo of someone, then that's going to need to undergo an IRB approval process. Again, the key here is really that you designed something that impacted other humans. So what is an IRB? We just mentioned that it stands for Institutional Review Board, and typically that IRB representing your research subjects in location is going to be the one that needs to approve your study. So if, for instance, you are working with a university, that university is the one who's going to need to approve your project. All regulated research institutions, such as universities, government labs, will have an IRB, but many high schools and school districts already have their formed IRBs as well. If your school or district does not have an IRB, and you're studying a student population, so say surveying your fellow high school students, you can always form one using the guide that's available in our rules book. You are, before you do that, going to want to check in with your superintendent's office, because sometimes you will have an IRB approval process already in place with your district, and you don't want to step on any toes there. But your first step to getting approval is that, one, you will draft your research plan, which is going to explain what you're going to do, to whom you will do it, outline risks, and so on. After you have that drafted, you will talk with a mentor or research teacher who will help you locate the IRB that will give proper permission to review your research plan. So again, as we just discussed, that's going to be either with the institution that you're working with a school, if you're working with a school population, and so on. But a trusted adult will help you figure out exactly who you need that approval from. Another important thing to note about IRBs is they all need to be properly constituted with at least 3 people, and none of those should be someone who is in a familial relationship with the student or a direct mentor of the project. So you can find more information about that in our rules book, but we do want to be very clear here that any project approved by an IRB where a member is related to or a mentor of the student researcher, that's grounds for an FTQ. That's grounds for the student to be disqualified.
So what happens next? You create your research plan, which is your idea, how you're going to do it. You're going to find your IRB, the appropriate group to review that. And what are they going to do? The IRB is going to review the project. They're going to look at your plan. What are you going to do? And they're going to determine any physical, psychological risks. They're going to review, are you doing this to any protected groups of people, like minors, for example, or particular disease or particular age range. They will either approve your project as is, like all looks good, all is safe. They might deny your project and say, absolutely not. They might, in a lot of cases, say something in between. And they might say, this looks cool. We want you to change these couple of things and then come back to us and we'll screen again. And that's really their job, is to make sure what you're doing is not harming other people. And so you have to respect what they say. Now, when these changes are requested, you're going to want to save this paper trail, and it allows you to show this to us later that you were asked to make a change, that you resubmitted it, the change was approved, and the dates when this all happened. So when you have paperwork from the IRB to share with us, because you had to go through this process, it's very important that the paperwork is actually filled out so that we can tell these things. There are some requirements. If you use our IRB form, you'll see the requirements right on there. If you're using the form from another institution, you're just going to want to make sure that we can clearly see the names of all people who reviewed the project and their signatures, and any boxes that they check of things you had to change or documents that you are going to be required to collect from your subjects. So on that note, they might say, you are good to do this project, but you're going to need to collect paperwork from your subjects. And what does that mean? What kind of paperwork? In a lot of cases, probably most cases, you're going to be asked to collect an informed consent from each participant. So you're going to draft this document. We have examples in the rules book that say, I so-and-so understand this is a high school research project, that I'm going to be asked to do this, and these are the risks. And if I have any concerns, I can go to this third party and complain or do whatever needs to be done. An informed consent is not always required by an IRB. If you're doing a simple online survey, they might waive it, for example. That's not always the case, kind of depends on the subject matter. But a new rule for STS this year, just to be super clear, it was clear in the rules book, but all projects that involve minors as the research population, minor children under age 18, all of those studies require informed consent or permission from the parents. Used to be that some classroom work didn't require that. This is a new rule. We will be disqualifying projects that do not have this parental permission for minors. Another kind of document that you might be asked to collect, if you're taking photos of your subjects and that's like important to your research, they might ask you to collect photo release from each participant. And then if you're studying a specific population and they just want to cover bases of that you had permission to work with them, like memory care patients at a nursing home, for example, we're going to want you to get some kind of documentation from the nursing home saying that you had permission to go in there and do that study. So the IRB provides this form that shows you we're in adherence. And again, it's very important that this form shows signatures, the dates that the project was approved, any changes that were made. And without this information, if you complete paperwork that doesn't show us this, you very well could be disqualified. We have examples of this from recent years where like a school or a hospital gives you an IRB approval that just said this project is approved, with no information about who approved it, And we just unfortunately can't accept that. We need to know that it was all above board. So do make sure that paperwork is completed correctly. The other thing in our application in task 3, you'll be asked if there were any additional paperwork requirements. So in addition to sharing with us that IRB approval form, if this is something your project needed, if the IRB has said you got to have informed consent or any of these other documents, we're going to request to see a blank copy of those documents. So we do not, nor is it appropriate for us to see the names of your research subjects. So don't give us the signed versions of the consent forms, but just the blank version to demonstrate that you did collect this, and so we can see what it looked like and if it was all above board. So that is the process for gaining pre-approvals. There are many circumstances involving humans where student researchers do not need to gain pre-approval and don't have to deal with this. And in those cases, you're working with human data or images. Maybe you're working with data that was given to you, but you played no role in the collection or a limited role in the collection. Maybe you were given a data set from a mentor, or you used images that you found in a public domain. Those are all examples of projects that are exempt. We'll talk about what that means next and what happens now.
So exempt research includes projects where you did not design the method of collection or influence the behavior, or maybe you're using data or cells that are publicly available. Those are all called exempt projects, and they are exempt from pre-approval by an IRB. So some situations where your project might be exempt, that's where you have human data from a public source. That could be behavioral observations in public settings. So say you're sitting on a bench and you are not changing anything or interacting with the environment in any way. You're just looking around you and making those observations. Could also be things such as commercially available cell lines. Cell lines are human tissue that are coming from a certified bank. So that's situations where you're using blood or breast milk, or self-collected tissue. So that's tissue that you have collected from yourself and no other populations or no other individuals. It might also be private data that you have received from a mentor and their unpublished study, from a hospital, and so on. So for studies involving any of those above scenarios, you're not going to need that pre-approval, but you will still be asked in the STS application to demonstrate where the materials or data were sourced, where those items are coming from. So for example, say you bought some human cells, you're going to need to show us a receipt of where that came from. But if you don't have a receipt, we're going to accept some alternatives, things like a letter from a mentor, etc. For public data, you're going to need to link the database or that published study to us. One small in-between exception here that we did want to discuss. If you've received data that is not published, you are going to need to share the IRB from the original study or the process note from the hospital or governing body of that study. Again, a lot of this can get pretty thorny, so use that rules wizard in task 3 to make sure that you are submitting the correct paperwork and are getting all the pre-approvals you need to do your project.
That's right. So at this point, we appreciate that you might be thinking, huh? What am I supposed to do? So if this does sound confusing, please know you are not alone. The world here does get complicated, and we know a lot of students kind of only pay attention to what rules really apply to their project. If you are unsure, here's something we recommend to everyone all the time. We've already recommended it once or twice in this session. Open an application, go to task 3. That is the rules wizard. And if you answer some of the if-then questions about your research or your planned research, it will then generate the questions that tell you what you're going to be asked to upload and what information you're going to be asked to collect. So the sooner you're aware of that, then the better you'll be able to collect that along the way as you do your research. So you're not scrambling at the last minute either. We know that can be an issue for students too. We also encourage mentors to do this if you especially if you have kind of similar projects coming out of your lab every year, then you're going to be on top of it for all the entrants who are participating. So whether or not your project is exempt or not exempt from pre-approval, on top of that, there are a whole bunch of rules you got to follow. And again, this is just to keep everybody safe who is doing research in this area. Let's talk about what some of those limitations are to human participant and tissue research, despite, again, whether or not your project needs pre-approval. these rules are universal, so know that these could apply to you. And then we're just going to kind of run through some of them. Student research cannot violate the Medical Practice Act. This means students should not be diagnosing diseases, administering medicines, or performing medical procedures. You are not a trained physician yet, so you should not be doing those things. Any tool that is created to diagnose must be supervised by a physician. And if you are actually having people use it for real, it needs FDA approval. If you're sharing results with patients. This is a tricky one. A lot of students will make prediction apps to detect skin cancer is kind of a popular topic we see. And they might use images that are training an algorithm to do this or whatever in their app. If you are having people test this, then it needs to go through an IRB approval process for sure. But it also cannot be like, you cannot be putting this on Apple Marketplace or you know what I mean, if it does not have FDA approval, right? So no, there could be very limited use and testing permissions. Students can support de-identified data collection under the supervision of a healthcare provider and with the permission of the IRB. So what does this mean? We haven't talked yet about what you do with your data, and de-identification is very important. So whether you're collecting the data or it's given to you, whenever you're publicly presenting, it needs to be de-identified. That means stripped of any information that's personally identifiable about the research subjects. Names, birth dates, potentially, depending on the nature of your project, what that means might be different. But know that you're not allowed to share or work with that data. If data is given to you from a mentor and it's not, especially if it's not published, it needs to be de-identified before you see it. So your mentor is going to be asked about this as well, and you'll have to certify that you worked with de-identified data, especially if it was given to you. So what this particular section is saying, if I can catch my slide up here, sorry, is that there is kind of an exception. So if you are helping to learn the process of doing what your mentor is doing to collect the data, you're helping to collect it for a bigger purpose, right? A great example of this is an eye exam, or sometimes collecting saliva samples or hair samples, something like that. You can help with the collection that then goes into the broader pool of de-identified data in the database. So if you have questions about this, you can ask us. But we do kind of allow, with permission of the IRB, that the student can support some of that as a learning opportunity in some cases. This one's been alluded to already, but students cannot prescribe or administer medication or supplements. That's a big one too. Supplements are really unregulated, so we don't know. We want to keep people safe. We'll discuss this a little bit more in the hazards webinar. You can use prescription drugs on cell lines and on plants, right? So we do see students working with prescription drugs, and there are some special things you have to do to obtain them and to provide the right paperwork. So more on that later. The other thing to consider in all this kind of work is PHBAs, potentially hazardous biological agents. So bacteria, parasites, that kind of thing. When you're working with tissue and cell lines, you might also be working with some of these organisms that can be quite dangerous. So you're going to need to do them in a particular setting. We recommend, if you're working with tissue, that you fill out our risk assessment form, and that you also watch our upcoming PHBA webinar. There are, again, some location-specific biosafety lab level rules that you might have to follow if you're working with those materials. And not just cell lines, any unknown tissue. So if you're using a self swab just from your own mouth, but you're culturing it, it needs to be cultured in a lab setting, that sort of thing. So more to come there. We talked about the de-identification thing. All human data must be de-identified before it is given to the student researcher. You should never publish or display identifiable information. And then the other thing that is an interesting rule, surveys. So surveys kind of fall in two categories. surveys that the student researcher creates and then distributes and collects the feedback. So if you designed the survey and you're distributing it, that counts as, human research. It needs pre-approval, all of that. The other bucket is sometimes students will administer to humans a survey that they did not design. That's like a known tool that assesses something. And they might use a couple of these survey tools that are published that measure something specific, and then use the results. So in these cases, in addition to following, whatever the IRB wants you to do, you will also need to show that you had permission to use these survey tools since you did not design them. Some of these survey tools, you can obtain permissions from a company and essentially rent the tool for a certain amount of time to use. Some of these tools will have very specific rules about how you administer them and how you score them. Some of these tools that maybe you help find research subjects for, if that's permitted, may not allow you as the high school student to actually perform the analysis. You might have to have a mentor help you with that. So pay close attention to the guidelines if any tool that you're using that you did not create, and you'll have to demonstrate that to us as well. But again, task 3 will kind of tell you what you need to do because we know this all sounds quite overwhelming.
So far, a lot of what we've talked about has been directed to the student researcher, but we know that mentors are a huge part of ensuring that students are safe and adhering to the rules. But there are a couple of things that you can do in particular to make sure that you are supporting your students to the best of your ability. So number 1 is save all the paperwork that is related to the student project. As we've alluded to many times, we ask on the application side for students to upload their paperwork, but say something goes missing or they forget a form or the form just doesn't load correctly. All of these things can happen. It can save a student if you as the mentor are also within the project recommendation uploading the student's paperwork where asked. Again, that is always the student's responsibility, but it doesn't hurt to help them out and make sure that you are keeping track of their paperwork as well and reminding them to do so for themselves. Another thing that can be super helpful is to start your recommendation as soon as possible. Every year we have mentors coming to us on the deadline, wondering if they can have more time to submit. And unfortunately, all recommendations are due when that application closes this year on November 6th at 8 p.m. ET. No materials, including recommendations, are accepted after the deadline. So it is absolutely in your best interest as the mentor to go ahead and get that started early. There are a couple questions you can complete without the student having completed their research, especially as we get farther into the year, especially if the student worked in your lab in a previous summer. This is something you can get out of the way soon and make sure that there is no heartbreak on that deadline. Another thing you can do, and this is one we keep mentioning over and over again because it is so true, test that rules wizard in task 3. It is both for the student's benefit and for yours to make sure that that student is going to have all the right paperwork and pre-approvals they need to submit to our competition and put their best foot forward. The last thing you can do is read our rules, and not just read them once, but read them annually. We make small changes every year, and so staying up to date with those is the best way to ensure that you are giving the student the proper guidance as well.
That's right. So we are now going to run through a handful of common scenarios that we see, kind of the most common scenarios we see every year pertaining to human participant or human tissue research. I have a huge caveat here, which is that every student situation is a little bit different. So if what we described today, it may not entirely apply to you, or it might, that's great. But if it doesn't, again, feel free to leave a comment and we'll get back to you in the next week or two so that we have a transparent thread of some similar situations people can learn about, or email us. We answer questions every day from students who are like, oh, is this okay? Is this not okay? And we'd rather you always check than not know. But again, some of the situations we're going to describe ever so quickly are so common that it will apply, I'm sure, to someone listening. So we thought this might help. All right, there's a lot of them, so bear with us. The first one, I used a commercially available human cell line, maybe from ATCC. Awesome, good for you. Here's what you're going to need to do. This project does not need to be pre-approved because you're purchasing this line. You did not create it or ask a human to change their behavior for it. However, you are going to have to demonstrate where did it come from. So we're going to ask you to upload a receipt of purchase. If your mentor purchased this cell line and they didn't do anything to it, you're just using, that cell line as is. And maybe a letter from them about when they purchased it. If they can't find the receipt, that will work too. So this is a really common one, and that's what we need.
The next one here is I am only using my own skin cells. So this project would also be exempt from pre-approval if you are using your own skin cells and nobody else's. So if just you are the only subject, then that is going to be exempt from that pre-approval. Again, in the application and in that project recommendation, we might just ask you to attest that you were safe while you were collecting those skin cells.
That's right. The next one, I pulled or used human-related medical data from a public database. Cool. This is data that you did not collect yourself. It is from a public source, so it is not exempt. You do not need pre-approval for this kind of project. However, you will again need to show the source. So because this is a public database, we're going to ask you for the link. Similarly, if you pull data from a published study, sending us the citation for that study along with the DOI link is something we're going to ask you to do. I was given human-related medical data from my mentor. So this one could be tricky because it depends where your mentor got it from. But first of all, we've identified you did not collect this. It is given to you. So you do not need pre-approval for your project for this. However, depends on the state of the data what we need to see. So if your mentor has given you data, and first of all, needs to be de-identified and stop, has to be de-identified when it gets to you. But if they've given you data that one comes from a study that they've published, cool. We just need to see the link of that publication. If they're sending you data that they have not yet published and you're using that in your study, then you're going to need their IRB for their study so that we know that the data that you're using for your project was obtained ethically, all above board, all of that. So you're going to need a copy of their IRB. We know in those cases, you're probably not going to be on their IRB, or maybe you will. I don't know, but maybe they pulled this data, they created this data like 5 years ago, right? Before you were working with them. So in any case, we will need to see the IRB from any unpublished data.
All right. I collected data from humans myself. So again, this could be anything, taking a survey, having students perform an action. This is going to be a situation where you do need that pre-approval in advance, and we are going to require IRB paperwork, potentially some other paperwork, depending on what populations you worked with, and again, certifying your adherence to the protocols of your institution.
That's right. The next one, I was given data that was not de-identified. So if your mentor is giving you data, or I've heard of this happening from hospital settings, interestingly enough, they've given you data that's not de-identified and you want to do something with it. You can't work with that. You're going to have to say, I can't work with that until it is de-identified and given back to me. And then we're going to need you to certify that it was de-identified when you worked with it, and your adult mentors to also certify that it was de-identified when it was given to you. We hear all the time from students who say, I went through a training at the hospital about how to safely handle data confidentially, and so I didn't need to do this. You do for us. So know that that is a requirement, and we do take that one seriously.
I used human blood or breast milk from a bank. So this is another example of an exempt project where you are not going to be asked for pre-approval, but we will probably ask you to demonstrate the source of those materials. So again, that might be something like a receipt, letter from the institution, etc.
That's right. And in those cases, you will probably also need to do a risk assessment because there's a risk for PHBAs. And if it's coming from a bank, then that's a little more above board. There are stricter rules, which we'll talk about in the PHBA session in a few weeks, where if it was obtained from a human, from an unknown source, not a bank, then it's kind of a different story. Anyway, the next one, I distributed a survey that I did not create. Cool. You are going to need permission from the source, and maybe that's even just the receipt that you purchased it and you were allowed to use it. Sometimes some of these tools you just email the person who created it, and they'll email you back and say, "Yeah, you can use it. Here's the stuff to do it." And we will ask that you go through IRB approval for this kind of a project as well. Just so that they're aware of what you're doing. And some tools are maybe not appropriate for a high school student to use, and they can help guide you towards one. In some of those cases, that might be more appropriate. So you'll need both of those things.
All right, I invented a piece of technology and asked humans to test it and provide feedback. This is one we see trip students up fairly often because they'll say, I did an engineering project, I didn't work with humans. But in this case, if they are testing it and providing feedback, then you absolutely do need that pre-approval from an IRB because you are testing with human subjects.
That's right. Similarly, the next one is I asked some friends to test my code. This one is controversial. People don't like this rule. We hear about it quite a bit. But for us, it's still you're asking a human for their feedback that you're incorporating. And especially then if you're testing that on other humans, then that counts as human subject research. So if the human is giving you feedback that impacts the work and then you're doing it again, then that will need some IRB pre-approval.
I used photos of humans from public database. This is another exempt study, but you are going to need to link us to that database.
That's right. And also you'll be asked to provide, if you use those images in your research report, you'll be asked to cite them at every instance, but there's more about that in the research report guidelines. I trained an algorithm with photos that I took of patients with a specific disease. This one is a little more complicated. If you took the photos of humans or that you found for this study, then it definitely needs IRB pre-approval. The IRB is probably going to ask you to collect, they should ask you to collect photo releases as well from these subjects. Because then the image is very important. It just depends, and the image says from, this example, it doesn't say, but sometimes the photo you take might be somewhat personally identifiable, right? If it's like of their face, and sometimes it might not be. So the IRB will kind of dictate like if that's allowed or not. And that will need to be included in the photo release as well. But definitely needs IRB pre-approval, definitely will need a photo release. And they may or may not approve something that identifies the face of the subject. We have seen studies where they do approve them, and we have allowed it if the facial features are essential to the disease that is being looked at. And that can be the case sometimes.
I made an app that detects skin cancer and I asked people to test it. So this is one where, again, if you're asking humans to test anything, you are going to need those pre-approvals. But this is especially tricky when we get into the diagnosis of disease, right? So if you are making an app, you can't have that on the App Store. It would need FDA approval. So just keep an eye on that one. That is very important.
Yeah. And you can certainly ask people to test it, but you cannot diagnose their results, and you cannot make it publicly available for like anyone to download, especially because they're not aware, right, that you're not a licensed medical professional behind it. The last example we have here is actually something we haven't talked about in this session. I can't believe it. But the example is I watched people at a crosswalk and logged their turn patterns. This is exempt from any pre-approvals. You don't need anything. Now, this is because you have not manipulated the behavior in any way of these people. If the situation was ever so slightly different, say you were watching people at a crosswalk and you logged their turn patterns after you turned the sign upside down. Well, you changed the environment that then is manipulating the behavior potentially of the subject. So in that case, you would need IRB approval to do that kind of a project. The other thing you should not be doing is taking photos unless you want an IRB to approve that in advance as well. So those are kind of the big set of very common scenarios that we see, and some of the ways that you might need to address them.
All right, so we know that this was a pretty dense presentation, lots of different information that may or may not apply to your project. But don't worry, in addition to this webinar, we have plenty of resources for you to be able to help yourself, for you as a mentor to be able to help your students. So a couple different things that we have available for you are our list of common FTQs, common reasons that students fail to qualify. This can just be helpful to see the things that trip people up year over year. Definitely take a look at that, make sure nothing applies to you. Another document we have available is our guide for creating your own IRB. So we talked a little bit earlier about how you'll need to use the IRB that is most closely related in terms of your study population and location for your pre-approvals. But say you're working with your high school population and your school or in your district don't already have an IRB process in existence, we have the guide for helping you get started with that. So students, this is a great thing to share with a trusted science teacher if that's something you need to get started for your project. Another great resource, of course, is our rules book. That is again, very dense document, but we promise it has all the information you need in order to make sure that you have the proper pre-approvals and paperwork for your project. A couple other things to point out here. You probably, we hope, have already opened your application, but if you haven't, the link is right there on the screen. Definitely, if you're a student, we'll hope to see you apply, and if you're an adult, you are more than welcome to go in and test that application, especially that task 3, just to help give guidance to your students. All we ask is that in task 1, you identify yourself as a teacher or another supportive adult, just so we don't include you in our final tally. A couple other things to point out here. Please don't forget our deadline to apply is November 6, 2025 at 8 p.m. Eastern. That is the date that all application materials are due. So that is the application itself, your paperwork, and your recommendations. So definitely keep that in mind. We have a technical support deadline 24 hours prior on November 5th. If you have any questions, you can always email us at sts@societyforscience.org. And we will be sure to get back to you with answers to any questions that you have for us. But if you want those answered transparently, again, please do feel free to leave those in the comments of this video, and we'll check back next week with our answers for you.
Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.